After 45 years of loyalty, my children treated me like trash. The moment my wife died, they shoved a worn envelope into my hands and sneered, "You were nothing but unpaid help, get out, and never come back." I stood there stunned as they threw me out of the home I helped build. Inside that envelope wasn't money, just an old rusted key. They laughed at what they thought was an old man's helplessness. But they were wrong. I didn't walk away to disappear. I walked away to begin a plan they would never forget. Hello, and welcome to the story. Before we discover why a rusted key was left to me after 45 years, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Also, a quick note, this is a fictional story, created for storytelling, intended to share meaningful and thought-provoking ideas. The air inside Alaric Prescott's office carried the scent of polished mahogany, and something colder, an unmistakable sense of finality. I sat in a tall leather chair that felt less like a seat at an inheritance meeting and more like a witness stand in a courtroom. My name is Callum Whitmore, 73 years old, a retired bridge inspector whose hands still carry the rough calluses of a lifetime spent testing steel bolts and foundations. Yet in that moment, surrounded by wealth and silence, I felt fragile like a blueprint caught in a storm. My wife, Marielle, had been gone for only 2 weeks. The quiet in the room felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were weighing the value of my existence. Across the desk stood Alaric Prescott, the maritime lawyer who had managed Marielle's legal affairs for decades. His voice, low and gravelly, carried the weight of a man accustomed to delivering uncomfortable truths. In his hand, he held a thick cream-colored envelope, the kind used for documents meant to change lives. He looked at me with a careful professional sympathy that made my stomach twist. By the tall window stood Cade Whitmore, 58, my oldest stepchild. He carried himself like a man who already owned the skyline of Seattle, his venture capital instincts visibly calculating every asset Marielle had left behind. Near him sat Leona Whitmore, 56, sharp and immaculate in a designer suit. She tapped one manicured nail against the polished table, with quiet impatience, her eyes colder than the luxury penthouses she managed. Maddox Whitmore, 54, could barely stay still. His leg bounced nervously under the table, the restless energy of a hedge fund gambler who had placed a risky bet and was waiting to see the outcome. And then there was Sloane Whitmore, the youngest at 52. She barely looked up from her phone, occasionally checking her reflection in the screen, as if this entire meeting were an inconvenience interrupting her next resort project. Alaric cleared his throat, the sound steady and mechanical, like the slow rotation of the ceiling fan above us. He began reading the distribution of Marielle's estate, $18 million in property investments and liquid assets. Each item was calmly assigned to the 4 people in that room. My chest tightened with every sentence. For decades they had treated me like a ghost in my own home, and now I was forced to watch as everything Marielle built was neatly divided between them. Then came the moment that shattered whatever hope I still carried. Alaric reached the clause that defined my position in Marielle's will. According to the document, our 45-year marriage had been categorized as domestic service. In legal language, I was not a husband, I was staff. Adequately compensated during my tenure, the will stated coldly. Have you ever felt the ground dissolve beneath your feet, while others calmly watched you fall? Cade laughed first, a harsh sound that echoed through the wood-paneled room. 45 years, he said, smiling with polished white teeth. That's a long time to work as a butler for free. Alaric slid a worn brown envelope across the table toward me without lifting his eyes. This, he said quietly, is your inheritance. Adequate compensation. 2 small words. 45 years erased. Cade checked his watch and told me to hurry up because they had a flight to Las Vegas to catch. Sloane stood leaving a business card for a budget senior shelter on the table beside me with a faint mocking smile. As they prepared to leave, Cade leaned close enough for me to hear his whisper. He admitted he had convinced Marielle's parents decades earlier to restructure the family trusts, making sure I would never receive a cent. Then they walked out together, a perfect wall of greed celebrating their victory. When the door slammed shut behind them, I looked down at the envelope in my hand. It was heavier than it should have been. Inside, something metallic shifted softly. I gripped the steering wheel of my 20-year-old truck so tightly that my knuckles turned pale, almost blending with the thick gray fog that often rolls through Seattle. The worn brown envelope rested on the passenger seat beside me, silent and harmless in appearance. Yet it felt like a ticking bomb waiting to explode. Even as I drove away, the sterile silence of Alaric Prescott's office still echoed inside my mind, broken only by the sharp, cutting laughter of my stepchildren. The streets of Madison Park curved quietly beneath the fading afternoon light as I drove through them almost without thinking. A strange numbness had settled over me, like a second skin wrapped around my body. By the time I reached the driveway of the mansion, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon. For nearly 50 years, I had called that house my home. Now it looked different. The towering structure of glass and stone stood before me like a monument to a life that no longer belonged to me. Its windows reflected the last glow of the evening sky, but there was no warmth in that light anymore. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the front door. The heavy door opened with a quiet groan, and the moment I stepped inside, my footsteps echoed across the marble foyer. The sound felt hollow, as if the house itself already knew I no longer belonged within its walls. Voices were absent for now, but I could almost hear the future arguments already forming, Cade and his siblings, dividing the furniture, the art, the silver. Everything I had spent a lifetime maintaining. Instead of lingering there, I turned toward the back hallway and retreated to my small library. It had always been my refuge, a modest room filled with the scent of old books dust and polished floor wax. Compared to the bright and luxurious rooms that filled the rest of the mansion, the library felt quiet and honest. The shadows there seemed more welcoming than the rest of the house. I sat down behind the mahogany desk and stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. My hands refused to stay steady. Finally, I tore it open. For a second, I expected to see a check, some small amount of money meant to serve as a final insult. Perhaps a few $1,000s, just enough for the children to pretend they had done the decent thing, while quietly pushing me toward a lonely retirement. But instead, something heavy slid out. A tarnished brass key dropped onto the desk with a dull metallic thud. It was attached to a small weathered tag by a frayed piece of twine. The key itself looked old, far older than anything in the mansion, its surface darkened with age and use. I picked it up slowly. The metal was cold and solid in my hand. Not paper, not money, not a legal dismissal, just a key. For 45 years, I had spent my career inspecting bridges, studying their foundations, measuring their stress points, making sure every bolt and beam held steady under pressure. And yet, as I held that key, I realized something unsettling. The life I believed I had built might have been nothing more than a structure resting on hidden secrets. The pillars beneath it had been hollow all along. Inside the envelope, I noticed one more thing: a single sheet of stationery. Marielle's handwriting covered the page in elegant, careful lines that I recognized instantly. My breath caught as I read the short message. "Go to Orcas Island. Trust me one last time." I stared at the words until they blurred. Orcas Island. The name was familiar, yet distant. Marielle had mentioned it occasionally over the years, always in passing. She called it the destination for her wellness retreats, quiet weekends she took every few weeks for nearly 4 decades. I had never questioned those trips. Never wondered why they were always necessary. Never suspected she might have been building another life, somewhere far beyond the reach of the Whitmore name. A strange chill crept through me. Have you ever looked at a photograph of someone you loved and suddenly realized you were staring at a stranger? That was the feeling settling in my chest. The light outside had grown dimmer now, the fading Seattle sunset stretching long shadows across the library floor. For a moment, the house was perfectly silent. Then the sound of an engine cut through the quiet. A sleek luxury car pulled into the driveway. The voices followed soon after, loud, confident, filled with the careless entitlement of people who believed they had just inherited the world. They were already arguing about the silver collection, about the artwork, about which rooms they planned to renovate first. I lowered my eyes to the brass key again and turned the small tag over beneath the soft glow of the desk lamp. At first it seemed blank, but then I noticed something hidden beneath the plastic sleeve attached to it, a second note written in a tiny, hurried scrawl. Words I hadn't seen before. "The key isn't for a house, Callum. It's for the truth." I felt the weight of the brass key settle deeper into my palm. It felt heavier than metal, heavier than memory, like an anchor pulling me away from the wreckage of the life I had just lost, and toward a horizon I couldn't yet see. I looked once more at the key, then at the small suitcase sitting in the corner of my closet, and for the first time in 45 years, I realized something strange. I was no longer waiting for permission to leave. The doorbell never rang. Instead, the front lock simply turned, and in that quiet mechanical motion, the Madison Park mansion stopped being a home and became something colder, a crime scene built from greed. I heard the heavy front doors swing open, followed immediately by the sharp, decisive click of high heels striking marble. I didn't need to see her to know it was Leona. I slipped into the upper wing of the house, the brass key resting in my pocket like a piece of frozen metal, and began packing with a quiet urgency. My movements were quick but careful, the kind of efficiency learned from decades of field inspections, where hesitation could mean disaster. I ignored the paintings, the antiques, and the silver pieces lining the hallway. Those things had never truly belonged to me. Instead, I packed the items that had traveled with me through my real life, my bridge inspection tools. The worn steel gauges, the calipers, the measuring instruments that had spent years in my hands beneath steel structures and wind-battered spans. They were the closest things I had ever had to loyal companions. My knuckles were still pale from gripping the steering wheel during the drive home, and my thoughts churned endlessly around Marielle's strange letter and the mysterious brass key. The envelope had rattled with that key like a quiet warning, and the sound still echoed in my mind. I had just begun folding a flannel shirt when the door flew open. Kate and Leona entered without knocking, followed by a sharply dressed woman in a charcoal business suit who carried a digital measuring device like an architect surveying an empty building. None of them acknowledged me. Instead, they spoke about me as if I were not in the room, as if I were an outdated appliance being evaluated before disposal. Leona gestured toward my mahogany dresser with a flick of her manicured hand. "That furniture belongs to the help's quarters," she said flatly. "It should be hauled out and dumped immediately." Cade leaned lazily against the doorway, his silhouette stretching across the floor like an oil stain. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone already celebrating victory. "We're going to gut this entire wing," he muttered. "The smell of old man and cheap tobacco is soaked into the drywall. Renovation is the only way to protect the property value." I tasted bitterness at the back of my throat mixed with the stale memory of coffee from the lawyer's office. But I said nothing. I focused only on closing the suitcase. "Are you still here?" Callum Cade finally asked, feigning surprise. "I assumed the moving van Alaric mentioned was for your ego, but it looks like you're planning to linger like a bad smell." I didn't respond. Instead, I snapped the suitcase latches shut and lifted the bag. As I reached for the light switch beside the door, a soft electronic chime echoed down the hallway. Click, the sound of a deadbolt engaging. In that moment, I understood something clearly. A locked door is the most honest sentence any Whitmore child had ever spoken to me. Cade had already changed the security codes while I was packing. Without saying a word, he had erased my access to the house before I even stepped outside. I had lived there for 45 years, yet I had just been digitally removed from its memory. With nowhere to go inside the house, I spent the next few hours sitting in a small guest room without windows, waiting for night to settle over the neighborhood. At 4 in the morning, I lifted my suitcase and quietly descended the grand staircase. Every step required careful placement to avoid the creaks I had memorized over decades of living there. When I reached the foyer, I stopped. Cade sat alone in the darkened living room, holding a glass of expensive scotch. In his other hand, he turned Marielle's favorite crystal vase slowly beneath the pale glow of moonlight. "Leaving already?" he asked without looking up. His voice sounded rough and sharp in the silence. "You didn't even say goodbye to the silverware." Cold morning air leaked through the front door's edges as I stood there. "Keep the silver, Cade," I said quietly without turning toward him. "You're going to need it to pay for the soul you've already lost." I walked outside without waiting for a reply. My old truck started with a deep diesel rumble that shattered the quiet of the wealthy neighborhood. As I pulled away, the mansion stood behind me in the rearview mirror like a stone mausoleum, an elaborate tomb for a marriage that had truly ended the moment Marielle's heart stopped beating. I drove slowly through the iron gates for the last time. Just beyond them, beneath a flickering street lamp, a dark sedan waited. When I turned toward the coastal road, the car pulled out behind me. Its headlights reflected in my mirror like two cold eyes. That was the moment I realized something chilling. The children hadn't been satisfied with taking my past. They were determined to hunt down my future too. I pressed the accelerator all the way down, and the aging engine of my truck responded with a strained roar as I sped along the winding highway toward Anacortes. The salty air drifting inland from the sound crept through the vents thick with the scent of the sea, but it did nothing to calm the burning tension in my chest. In the rearview mirror, the same pair of headlights that had appeared outside the Madison Park gates followed me relentlessly steady and patient, like a predator pacing its prey. Cade's influence suddenly felt enormous, stretching across miles of asphalt like a long shadow that refused to break. By the time I reached the ferry terminal, the road noise still rang in my ears. I slammed the gear into park just as the ferry's steel loading ramp struck the dock with a harsh metallic crash. The sound echoed like a final punctuation mark on the life I had just abandoned on the mainland. When I stepped onto the deck, the low constant vibration of the ferry engines traveled through the soles of my boots, a dull humming reminder that the world was still moving forward, and so was I. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. My eyes scanned the loading area, carefully moving from car to car until they caught a familiar shape. A black SUV sat several vehicles back, its glossy surface reflecting the harbor lights. It was the same one that had been glued to my bumper for the last 50 miles. "Not today," I muttered quietly under my breath. "Not today, you vulture." When the ferry crew began directing vehicles into their designated lanes, they signaled for the Orcas Island line. Instead of following the instruction, I casually steered my truck toward the Lopez Island holding lane instead. In the mirror, I watched the SUV drift into the same lane behind me. Perfect. Then just seconds before the boarding barrier dropped, I jerked the wheel sharply and swung my truck back into the Orcas Island line. The sudden maneuver left the SUV boxed in behind a line of oversized tourist RVs and confused drivers who had no intention of moving anytime soon. For the first time that night, I allowed myself a breath of relief. The ferry pulled away from the dock moments later, its engines churning the dark waters of the Salish Sea as the mainland slowly drifted farther into the distance. I stood near the rail and watched the shoreline shrink each mile of water, creating more space between me and the Whitmore children. But another thought crept quietly into my mind during the 90-minute crossing. How many years can pass before you realize that the person you shared your bed with was secretly playing chess while you believed you were simply living life? And worse, what if you had been the protected piece on that board all along? The question lingered with me until the ferry finally reached Orcas Island. When the ramp lowered and I drove off the vessel, the world immediately felt different. The air here was heavier, filled with the earthy smell of wet cedar moss and decaying pine needles. It was a raw, natural scent that stood in stark contrast to the polished sterility of Seattle's luxury neighborhoods. As I rolled toward the small ferry terminal, I spotted her immediately. A woman stood beside the parking area, holding a small sign with my name written across it. Saskia Thorne, 70 years old. Silver hair braided tightly like a thick maritime rope, watched my truck approach, with unmistakable relief in her eyes. She didn't bother with introductions. "You're late, Callum," she said the moment I stepped out of the truck, her voice rough but steady. "Marielle said you'd arrive earlier." I stared at her momentarily stunned, the brass key in my pocket, suddenly feeling heavier than before. "She told you I was coming," I asked slowly. 40 years ago, Saskia simply gave a quiet, knowing smile and motioned toward a battered Jeep parked nearby. Its tires were thick with dried mud. "She said you'd come when the wolves finally showed their teeth," Saskia replied. I climbed into the passenger seat without another word, and moments later, we were driving deeper into the island's interior. The forest swallowed us quickly. Moss covered everything, thick green blankets draped across ancient trees creeping over stones and hanging from branches like silent witnesses. It felt as if the entire forest was hiding secrets beneath that soft green skin. Saskia handled the Jeep with the confidence of someone who had driven those roads for decades. The vehicle bounced violently over uneven ground as she turned onto a narrow, restricted forest road that seemed to devour the morning light. Then she said something that shattered the fragile sense of victory I had been holding on to. "That SUV you dodged back at the ferry," she said casually, keeping her eyes on the road. It wasn't working for Cade. I turned toward her sharply. It was part of a protective detail Marielle hired. Saskia continued calmly. "Their job was to make sure you stayed safe from the moment she died." For a moment, I couldn't speak. In my panic, I had outrun the very people assigned to protect me. The Jeep skidded to a stop seconds later. Ahead of us stood a massive set of iron gates, their rust-stained bars looking almost like dried blood against the deep green of the forest. They loomed from the earth as if they had been waiting there for decades, waiting for me. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking as I stared at the crest forged into the iron. I reached out and touched the iron scrollwork, half expecting the gates to burn my skin for trespassing on a secret Marielle had died to keep. The metal was freezing, weeping rust onto my calloused fingertips. Saskia didn't hesitate. She took the brass key I had been clutching like a talisman and slid it into the lock. Despite the neglected appearance of the exterior, the heavy click of the iron gate hinges was effortless. They were well-oiled, maintained with a precision that mocked the decay of the metal. We drove up a winding quarter-mile driveway, the tires of the Jeep crunching over gravel, while old-growth Douglas firs arched overhead, stitching together a canopy that effectively blocked out the sky. When we finally emerged into a clearing, the sight nearly stole the breath from my lungs. It was a 19th-century fieldstone homestead, a rugged and beautiful fortress perched on a jagged cliff edge. Below us, the gray expanse of the Pacific churned, sending a fine mist of salt spray into the air. This was no falling-down cottage as Cade and Leona had sneered in Seattle. This was a legacy. "It's not a ruin, Saskia," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "It's a fortress." She looked at me with a softness I hadn't expected. She called it a sanctuary Callum, a place where the world couldn't reach you. Walking into that house was like stepping inside the chambers of a heart that had been beating for me in total silence for half a century. The interior didn't smell like a museum or a tomb. It smelled of lavender-scented furniture wax and the sharp, clean tang of sea salt. I walked into the open-plan living area and stopped dead. My heart, already fragile, seemed to skip a beat. The walls weren't decorated with the abstract art Marielle favored in Seattle. Instead, they were covered in hundreds of frame-candid photographs. They were all of me. I saw myself in the 80s helmet on, inspecting the underside of a suspension bridge. There was a shot of me, sleeping in my favorite chair, a book splayed on my chest. I touched the cold glass of a frame from 1988, showing me laughing at a joke I'd long since forgotten. As I stood there, Saskia handed me a leather-bound folder. My eyes blurred as I read the deed. The property had been in my name since 1978. I had been the legal owner of a multi-million-dollar estate for 35 years, without ever knowing it. How do you reconcile the woman who called you a servant in her will with the woman who built a stone cathedral to your existence? I felt seen in a way that was almost violent. Saskia stood by the window watching the waves. Every time she left Seattle, she came here to curate this, she said quietly. You were her only masterpiece. I moved toward the fireplace where a large photo sat at the center of the mantel. It wasn't just of me. It was a candid shot of me and Marielle together in 1986, the very year she allegedly began her descent into cruelty. We were smiling, leaning into each other, with an intimacy that felt like a punch to my ribs. My eyes locked onto a photo I had never seen a picture of me from only 3 months ago, taken through a window I thought was closed. Someone had been watching me even when I was alone. The realization that I had spent 45 years living as Marielle's shadow, while she quietly designed the architecture of my survival, made the air inside the living room feel thick, almost sacred. Her presence lingered everywhere. I stood in front of the newest photograph on the wall, the one taken through the study window only a few months earlier, and a cold shiver moved through me, one that had nothing to do with the damp island air. Saskia stepped closer and reached into her coat pocket. When she withdrew her hand, a second key rested in her palm. Unlike the tarnished brass key I had carried across the sea, this one was polished to a mirror shine. The metal caught the light like silver water, and when she placed it in my hand, it felt surprisingly cool. This is the final piece, Callum, she said quietly, her voice lowering into something almost ceremonial. Everything else is between you and the letters. I closed my fingers around the silver key, feeling the cold weight of it settle into my palm. Did she ever talk about me when she came here? I asked. My voice barely rose above a whisper. Saskia didn't hesitate. Every single day she replied, usually while she was writing. For a moment I said nothing. Then I turned away from the walls of photographs, the strange museum Marielle had built out of my own life, and walked slowly toward the staircase. Each wooden step gave off a soft, familiar creak beneath my weight. The sound felt grounding, like a steady rhythm guiding me upward. Downstairs had been a gallery of my visible life photographs, memories, fragments of years I thought I understood. Upstairs waited something entirely different, the hidden center of Marielle's mind. At the top of the stairs stood a heavy oak door. I stopped in front of it and lifted the silver key toward the lock. For a moment I hesitated. Some instinct told me that turning that key would end the man I believed myself to be, and perhaps create someone else entirely. My eyes drifted to the small brass plaques mounted beside the doorframe. Dates had been etched into them carefully. The records inside the room didn't begin with our wedding. They began in July 1986, the exact month I had been promoted to senior bridge inspector. For decades I had remembered that promotion with pride. It had felt like the peak of my professional life. Now standing there with the key poised in the lock, I realized something unsettling. That moment may have been the trigger for everything that followed. I inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked softly. When the door opened, silence greeted me. Not an empty silence, but something heavier, like the quiet inside an old library where every book tells the story of a single life, mine. 3 walls of the study were completely covered with shelves. Each shelf held identical binders and sealed envelopes, all meticulously labeled. They stood in perfect rows organized with a precision that reminded me of the sterile efficiency of a corporate laboratory. This wasn't a random collection of letters, it was an archive. A complete parallel history of our marriage. The records began in the summer of 1986 and continued without interruption all the way to March 2021, 420 letters. One for every month Marielle had spent acting distant, cold, and seemingly indifferent to the man she had married. I stood there staring at the shelves, overwhelmed by the scale of it. If a woman spends 35 years writing letters to a husband who believes she despises him, what does that make her a saint or a strategist? At the center of the study sat a large mahogany desk. On top of it rested a single envelope that stood apart from everything else. It was thick and cream-colored. Across the front, written in Marielle's familiar, precise cursive, were 3 simple words. Read this first. The room smelled faintly of old paper dust, and something else, a faint metallic scent, that seemed to drift from a nearby security server, humming quietly against the wall. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the envelope. The heavy paper resisted my grip, as though the message inside carried real weight. I broke the red wax seal with my thumb. The brittle shell cracked with a sharp snap that echoed softly through the silent room. As the envelope opened, a scent drifted upward from the pages, a faint floral fragrance. Marielle's original wedding perfume. I hadn't smelled it in decades. For a moment, the scent felt like a ghost rising from the past. Inside the envelope were more than just sheets of paper. My fingers brushed against something solid, a small plastic micro SD card and a folded parchment map that detailed the entire estate, including the locations of hidden security sensors embedded throughout the property. This wasn't just a diary. It was a command center. I unfolded the letter slowly, the soft rustle of paper filling the stillness of the study. My heart beat loudly in my chest, matching the steady ticking of the antique clock mounted on the wall behind me. Then I read the first line. It didn't ask for forgiveness. Instead, it began with something far stranger, an apology, for the fact that I had survived. The first sentence of Marielle's letter did not ask for forgiveness. Instead, it delivered something far colder, an almost clinical apology for the fact that I was still alive. I sat motionless in the quiet study, the broken wax seal releasing the faint scent of her old wedding perfume. It mingled strangely with the dry smell of aged paper and the metallic tang of ozone from the nearby security equipment. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the first page of her confession. What I read there shifted the entire weight of my life. Marielle wrote with a kind of brutal honesty that made the room seem to tilt around me. For 35 years, she explained she had lived as if she were a stranger, inhabiting her own body. June 14th, 1986. The date was written clearly in her elegant script, was the day the woman I loved had effectively died. In her place, she wrote a protector had been born. The realization drained the air from my lungs as the logic of our broken marriage slowly assembled itself in my mind. For decades, I had believed our distance was the slow erosion of love. But Marielle described it as something entirely different. It had been strategy, a defense plan. Every cold word, every public humiliation, every moment of silence had been part of a calculated effort to keep me alive. The conspiracy against me, she revealed, had not started with the greed of her children. It had been planted much earlier by her own parents. To them, I had always been nothing more than a low-born bridge inspector who had somehow slipped into their carefully built biotech dynasty. They considered me an embarrassment to their empire, an obstacle to the future they envisioned for the Whitmore name. And so, they began whispering poison into Cade's ears. By the third page, my throat tasted faintly of copper, a bitter metallic sensation that often accompanies shock. It felt as if my body itself were reacting to the realization that my life had once been the target of a carefully planned elimination. Have you ever discovered that the person you believed was destroying you was actually the one quietly holding death at bay? Marielle's letter pulled me backward through time to a rainy evening in 1986 at our Madison Park house. She described coming home late from a meeting, the scent of wet wool and cold rain clinging to her coat as she walked down the dim hallway toward the children's bedrooms. She had planned to wish Cade goodnight, but as she approached his door, she heard laughter, cruel laughter. The voices inside the room belonged not only to her children, but also to her parents. Marielle wrote that she froze in place outside the door as she listened to them speak about me, not as a husband, not even as a person, but as an inconvenience that needed to be managed. They discussed my future the way farmers discuss livestock. Their plan was chillingly simple. They would slowly convince the world that I was losing my mind, gaslight me into a diagnosis of dementia, then quietly place me in a facility called Shady Pines. The name sounded harmless, but Marielle explained the truth. Shady Pines was not a retirement home. It was a warehouse for forgotten people, a place where inconvenient family members disappeared into sterile rooms and were rarely seen again. Once I was locked away, they planned to bypass our prenuptial agreements and gain control of Marielle's $15 million in company shares. She even wrote down Cade's words from that night. His voice had still been young then, but already carried the sharp confidence of someone learning how power worked. He argued that I would be perfectly content as long as I had a window and 3 meals a day. Reading that line made my chest tighten. Marielle described gripping the cold metal railing in the hallway as she listened to the vibration of her own anger traveling through the steel. Her knuckles had turned white, but she forced herself to remain silent. The twist, however, was even darker than overhearing a family conspiracy. Marielle hadn't merely been listening. Earlier that evening, she had planted a small recording device in the room to catch evidence of a corporate leak she suspected within the company. Instead, the device recorded something far more horrifying. It captured her own family planning my social execution. She stood in that hallway, frozen in the darkness, listening as her parents encouraged their grandchildren to destroy the man she loved. Even as I sat there in the island study decades later, I could almost hear the echo of that laughter carried across time. The handwriting in the letter grew more jagged as Marielle described that moment. Several lines were blurred where tears had fallen onto the paper 35 years ago. That was the moment she made her decision. If she wanted to save my life, she would have to destroy our marriage. The only way to stop them from killing me quietly was to convince them that I no longer mattered to her. She would become the villain, a cold, cruel woman who treated her husband like hired help. It was the role she began playing that very night, and she would continue that performance until the day she died. The letter shifted from the past to the plan detailing the birth of the woman I spent 35 years fearing. To save the man I loved, the paper read in Marielle's unwavering cursive, I had to make sure the world believed I didn't love him at all. I sat in the absolute silence of the study, the scratchy texture of the heavy stationery beneath my fingers. Marielle explained that the servant language in the will wasn't the final insult I'd felt in Alaric's office. It was a surgical legal maneuver. By classifying me as domestic staff, she had ensured the children could never claim I had used undue influence as a spouse to manipulate her estate. It was a shield, not a slight. She detailed how she began the systematic dismantling of our public partnership, starting in July 1986. She stopped including me in corporate galas, instructed the household staff to treat me as a guest rather than a master, and began the performance of the cold matriarch. She wrote that if the children thought I was her partner, they would destroy me to get to her. I made you a ghost, so they would stop trying to make you a corpse, she confessed. I stared at the row of identical binders on the wall, the fading light reflecting off their spines. Every time she had missed a birthday or forced me to eat in the kitchen, I had felt a piece of my soul wither. But the letter claimed that every harsh word spoken in front of Cade or Leona was a calculated lie. Every cold glance was a prayer for my safety. She would come here to Orcas Island later that same month during those wellness retreats I never questioned, to write me a letter of apology I was never meant to see until I was safe. Could you live with a person for 40 years, feeling their coldness every day if you knew that coldness was the only thing keeping the sun from burning you alive? Apology. After apology. After apology. Organized by year. A ledger of a broken heart. I realized then that while I was mourning the death of our marriage, she was in this very room mourning the woman she had to become. She wrote that she hated that cold version of herself more than I ever could. She had been my architect, while I was merely her shadow. The smell of the old mahogany desk seemed to ground me as I turned another page. Marielle revealed a final layer to this foundation of secrets. She had secretly deeded this Orcas property to me, back in 1978 as a wedding gift. It predated the children's inheritance claims and the family trust's bylaws by years, making the sanctuary legally untouchable and entirely mine. The property wasn't part of her estate. It was an island I had owned in total ignorance while I lived as a ghost in Madison Park. I heard the paper rustle in the silence, a sound like a long-held breath finally being released. The binders on the walls weren't just records. They were the bricks of a fortress she had spent her life building for me. Every year, every month, every day of her supposed hatred was a payment into a trust of protection. I looked at the spines of the binders, realizing that for 35 years, while I thought I was losing my wife, she was actually building me a kingdom. She had traded her own peace to ensure that one day I would have mine. I turned to the next section of Marielle's letter, and immediately the tone changed. The sorrowful voice of a wife faded, replaced by something colder and sharper, the calculated clarity of a seasoned executive. The handwriting itself seemed different, the sentences tighter and more precise, outlining a financial structure that had been quietly operating beneath my life for decades without my knowledge. Marielle revealed the existence of what she called an invisible fortress. It was a private trust worth $1,200,000 managed by a discreet third-party firm located right here on Orcas Island. This wasn't a sudden gift prepared at the end of her life. The account had been growing slowly for years. Since 1978, Marielle had been quietly diverting portions of her personal performance bonuses into that fund long before her children had even become adults. The system had been designed with meticulous precision. The trust automatically paid the property taxes on this island estate, covered every utility expense, and provided a stable monthly stipend that would last for the next 50 years. Even if I never earned another dollar, the house and everything within it would remain secure. She had been building a financial shield around me for decades. They believed they took everything she wrote in one of the lines, but all they really took was the bait. Reading those words, a slow realization began forming in my mind. While Kate and the others had been celebrating their victory over Marielle's $18 million estate, they had unknowingly inherited something far more dangerous. Much of what they believed to be wealth was tied to over-leveraged real estate and corporate investment structures, burdened with high-interest debt liabilities Marielle had deliberately left unresolved. They had inherited the Whitmore name and its tangled obligations. But I, the man they had cast out as worthless, was the only one who had actually been freed from the trap. A quiet question appeared halfway down the page, written in Marielle's steady hand. "Do you remember the moment you stopped being a father and became a threat?" She answered it herself. It was the day I inherited my first $10 million. Inside the envelope with the letter, she had included a printed copy of the bank statement from that year. The numbers glowed coldly on the page when I held it up to the study lamp. It confirmed everything she had written, but the document meant far less to me than the memories that followed. Marielle's writing softened again, as she drifted backward into the late 1970s, the years she called our honeymoon era. As I read, I could almost smell the mixture of motor oil and warm pavement from a Seattle summer afternoon in 1976. I had been 28 then, a young bridge inspector who spent most of his days climbing steel beams and crawling through structural joints. Marielle, meanwhile, was already rising quickly within her parents' biotech company. We were building our lives together. For a moment, the silent study around me seemed to fill with ghosts of those early years. I remembered standing in the driveway beside a small bicycle teaching a young Cade how to fix a slipped chain. "Hold the wrench steady," I had told him patiently. "Integrity begins with the smallest parts." Another memory followed close behind it. 7-year-old Sloane sitting cross-legged on the living room rug while I read bedtime stories. Back then she had called me Dad without hesitation. "We were a real family," once Callum Marielle wrote. I had to bury those memories so the predators wouldn't smell my weakness. The line struck me with unexpected force. She compared memory to a bridge with rusted floorboards, something beautiful but dangerous to cross. "Step too carelessly," she warned, "and you could fall straight back into the pain." A single tear slipped down my cheek as I continued reading her apology for the decades of silence she had forced between us. This island sanctuary, she explained, had never been built as an escape from me. It was meant to preserve what we once had, a place untouched by the greed of her parents. The final paragraph on the page contained the most startling revelation of all. That private investigator I had believed Cade hired to follow me. He had never belonged to Cade. Years earlier, Marielle had established a small protective detail through the Island Trust. Their sole responsibility had been to monitor my safety and ensure that once Marielle died, I would reach the ferry terminal unharmed. The realization hit me like a physical blow. During the entire drive to Anacortes, I had been consumed by paranoia, desperately trying to outrun the SUV that followed me. In truth, I had been fleeing from the only protection Marielle had left behind. I stood slowly from the desk, my legs heavy as if gravity itself had thickened around me. The study walls rose around me, 3 towering shelves filled with binders that held 35 years of secrets. My eyes moved across the labels until they stopped on the very first one. July 1986. I reached out and touched the spine of the binder. The rough surface felt strangely alive beneath my fingers, as if I were brushing against the skin of a truth that had waited 35 years to finally scream. The first binder felt heavier than Marielle's 20-page confession, its thick pages softened and yellowed by years of damp island air. I opened it slowly, the faint crackle of aging paper filling the silent study. For a moment, I skimmed past the early years' records of cruel remarks, small manipulations, petty acts of theft that once felt like random cruelty. But instinct guided my hands toward a darker chapter. The binder marked 2010. That was the year the accidents stopped looking like accidents. I slid the March section from the shelf, my skin prickling with unease as I searched through the labeled folders. When I reached March 12th, a chill crawled up my spine. I remembered that day far too clearly. The memory struck me like a physical blow. That morning had begun quietly in the Madison Park mansion. I had woken early, my mind already focused on a complicated bridge blueprint that needed to be finalized before the end of the week. I walked down the hallway toward the grand oak staircase, thinking about steel load distribution and cable tension. Then everything changed in a single second. My foot hit the third step, and suddenly there was no grip beneath it. I slid. The world spun violently as I tumbled down the staircase. 12 steps blurred together in a chaotic rush of wood and gravity. When my body finally slammed against the oak floor of the foyer, the impact knocked the breath from my lungs. Pain exploded through my arm and chest. The result was catastrophic. A shattered wrist, 3 broken ribs. Every breath afterward felt like inhaling shards of glass. At the time, I remembered Marielle appearing calmly at the top of the staircase. She had looked down at me while the paramedics lifted my body onto a stretcher. Her face had been cold, unreadable. "You are getting old, Callum," she had said evenly. "Clumsiness is a luxury we cannot afford in this house." I had whispered back weakly that I hadn't tripped. I had slid. But she had already turned away. At least that was what I had believed for years. Now standing in the sanctuary study decades later, Marielle's records revealed a far darker structure behind that moment. Inside the March folder, I discovered a tiny SD card carefully taped to the inner cover. My fingers trembled slightly as I inserted it into the laptop resting on the desk. The machine responded with a quiet mechanical click. Seconds later, the screen flickered. A grainy blue night vision recording appeared. The camera was pointed directly at the staircase in our Madison Park home. My blood ran cold. The timestamp showed the early hours of the morning, long before I had woken that day. Then a figure stepped into the frame. Maddox. He was dressed entirely in black, his hands covered in leather gloves. With slow, deliberate movements, he crouched on the staircase and applied a thick layer of lubricant across the 3rd, 4th, and 5th steps. Not cooking oil, not anything harmless. The label in Marielle's folder identified it clearly. Industrial-grade lubricant, colorless, odorless, deadly. On the video, Maddox worked with careful precision, spreading the slick substance until the wood gleamed faintly under the night vision glow. When he finished, he stood and glanced directly toward the hidden camera. He smiled. The expression pierced straight through my chest. He hadn't simply hoped I might fall. He had constructed the trap. The documentation in the folder made things even worse. Marielle had traced the purchase order for the lubricant to a corporate account shared between Maddox and Cade. They had planned it together. 2 brothers collaborating to make sure I never survived the spring of that year. A question echoed painfully in my mind as I watched the video. Can someone love you so deeply that they allow your bones to break in order to keep your life from ending entirely? The footage answered that question moments later. 5 minutes after Maddox disappeared into the shadows, another figure entered the frame, Marielle. She moved slowly down the staircase, stopping when she reached the foyer. I expected to see her wipe away the oil erase the trap, save me from what was coming, but she didn't. Instead, she walked to the small table beside the staircase and carefully repositioned a heavy ceramic vase. At first, the action seemed meaningless. Then I understood. She wasn't removing the trap. She was redirecting it. If I fell the way Maddox intended, my body would have slammed headfirst into the sharp marble edge of the table behind the staircase. The impact would have crushed my skull instantly. Marielle angled the vase and the furniture around it to shift the trajectory of my fall. She couldn't stop the accident without revealing the conspiracy. So she chose the only option left: broken bones instead of a broken neck. I paused the video. The screen froze on Marielle's face as she stared at the lubricated steps. For years, I had remembered that expression as cold indifference. Now, I saw something else. Agony. Silent, unbearable agony. A sickness rose in my stomach, as if I could smell the industrial lubricant through the screen itself. Its metallic sharpness cutting through the present like a ghost from the past. My children had tried to kill me, and my wife had stood nearby, watching my body break because it was the only way she could keep me alive. The next folder was thicker, its label written in a red ink that felt like a warning. I pulled a grainy high-contrast photo from the August 2011 folder, a jagged severed brake line that looked less like a mechanical failure and more like a surgical strike. The sharp metallic scent of the oil in the photograph seemed to trigger a phantom memory of burnt rubber and hot asphalt. I was transported back to that terrifying afternoon in Seattle. I remembered the exact moment the brake pedal of my vintage truck hit the floorboard without a hint of resistance. The panic was a cold spike in my chest as I swerved to miss a school bus. The screech of tires screaming against the pavement before a bone-shaking impact with a concrete barrier threw me forward. At the time, I was merely shaken and confused, but Marielle's arrival had been the true blow. She didn't come with a hug or a word of comfort. She arrived with a lawyer and a cold clinical assessment for the police. She told them I was sundowning, that I could no longer be trusted behind the wheel. The brakes just died. Mary L. I had pleaded, my hands still trembling from the crash. She had looked right through me. No, Callum, your reaction time died. We are selling the truck tomorrow. The sting of that helplessness had burned for 7 years, a resentment I had carried like a lead weight. Kate had sat at the dinner table that night, with a smug, knowing smile, nodding along as Marielle stripped me of my independence. But as I sat in the sanctuary study, the truth revealed a much more predatory design. I discovered that Kate had sabotaged the truck specifically on the day I was scheduled to drive my infant granddaughter Maya to the park. The realization made a cold sweat break across my neck. My own son was willing to sacrifice his niece just to ensure my accident looked like a senior's mistake. Crushed, the truck, my pride, all to hide a pair of wire snips. I looked at an invoice Marielle had hidden away from a private mechanic she'd hired to inspect the wreckage before the insurance companies could touch it. The report was blunt. The lines were cut with heavy-duty wire snips. A secondary report contained a receipt for a disposal fee. Marielle had paid triple to have my beloved truck crushed, immediately ensuring no evidence remained that could tip off Cade that his attempt had been discovered. Have you ever hated someone for protecting you, only to realize your resentment was the only thing keeping you from seeing the monster in the room? I could almost hear the car crusher's rhythmic groan in my imagination. My anger at her control had been the very cloak she used to keep me from realizing I was a target in my own home. I realized the truck sale wasn't an act of dominance. It was a desperate act of preservation. A final private memo from Marielle to herself sat at the bottom of the pile. She hadn't just pocketed the money from the sale, she had moved every cent into the Orcas security fund. She had turned Cade's murder weapon into the very foundation of my protection here on this island. I turned the page and found a copy of a $450,000 promissory note with my signature on the bottom, a signature I knew with absolute certainty I had never written. The ink on the promissory note looked fresh even 7 years later, a blue-black stain on my reputation. The blue ink of my forged signature screamed off the page, a perfect imitation of a man who had no idea he was being legally executed in his own dining room. I sat in the sanctuary study, a phantom headache throbbing behind my temples as the memory of May 2012 clawed its way back to the surface. It was a Tuesday family dinner, the air thick with the smell of roast lamb and expensive red wine. Leona Whitmore had leaned back in her chair, casually bringing up a private debt she claimed I owed her for a failed real estate investment. I remember the sheer staggering confusion that washed over me. I had never even heard of the company she mentioned. I produced a stammered denial, but Leona was ready. She produced this very note in front of everyone, passing it around like a trophy, while the grandchildren watched in wide-eyed silence. I felt a burning shame that made my ears ring. Marielle hadn't defended me that night. She had snapped at me in front of the children, sighing about my failing memory and financial incompetence. That dinner had been the moment I truly began to doubt the structural integrity of my own mind. Ash. The note was mostly ash, a half-burned lie Marielle kept as a trophy of my survival. I found the real May 2012 folder, tucked behind a false panel in the binder. Inside was the original forged note, its edges charred from a flame that was never allowed to finish the job. Beside it lay a dry clinical handwriting expert's report that Marielle had commissioned in the total secrecy. The expert confirmed the forgery with absolute certainty. Marielle's monthly letter, written in her jagged emotional hand, explained the brutal math of that month. She had to gaslight me in front of the children. She had to make them believe their debt trap was working, because if she had exposed the forgery, then they would have pivoted to a more violent method. What is harder to endure, a wife who hates you, or a wife who has to pretend she does to keep you out of a courtroom or a casket? The letter revealed that she had secretly neutralized the debt by paying Leona off with a private gift that carried a lethal non-disclosure clause. But there was a deeper layer to the counter-forgery. Marielle hadn't just paid the money. She had forced Leona to sign a full written confession of the forgery as a condition of receiving the funds. I held the confession in my hands, feeling the weight of the leverage Marielle had gathered, while I was busy fearing my own shadow. I realized the gaslighting was also a setup for a future legal battle. Marielle wanted a house full of witnesses to her own public cruelty, so the children could never claim she and I were co-conspirators in hiding assets. She was building a court-ready defense of her own villainy. She paid them in blood, so they wouldn't ask for mine, sacrificing my dignity to buy my safety. I felt a wave of anguish for the woman who had to sit across from me at dinner, watching me crumble while she held the proof of my innocence in her locked desk. I turned to the 2013 binder and saw a small plastic baggie stapled to the first page. It contained 2 identical white pills that I knew were never meant to heal me. The baggie crinkled under my thumb, the sound of a pharmaceutical death sentence echoing in the small study like the rattle of a snake. I stared at the two identical white pills inside, feeling a cold moisture bloom on my neck. I remembered 2013 as a year of vibrating horizons and a constant heavy thrumming in my skull. My blood pressure had become a ticking bomb, and the sound of blood rushing in my ears was a rhythmic warning I didn't know how to heed. I relived those mornings at the breakfast table in Madison Park, feeling my face flush and my heart hammer against my ribs, while Sloan Whitmore watched me with a clinical expectant smile. She was my youngest stepdaughter, the one I had read stories to. Yet she sat there sipping her orange juice as if she were waiting for a grand finale. Marielle had dismissed my blurry vision as old age whining, whenever the children were around her voice, a sharp blade of public indifference. "I don't understand why I feel like my head is going to explode," I had whispered to her once in the kitchen. She had simply told me to lie down and stay there. I discovered the truth was far more sinister than aging. Sloan wasn't just acting on a whim of greed. She was using me as a test case for the sugar pill method, perfecting a way to accelerate an inheritance by quietly removing the obstacles. Have you ever sat across from someone you raised, watching them drink orange juice while they waited for your heart to fail? The binder contained the proof I never asked for: grainy black and white hidden camera stills of Sloan entering the kitchen at midnight, her face illuminated by the refrigerator light as she systematically replaced my lisinopril with those clinical, sweet-tasting placebos. But the horror was matched by a staggering revelation of love. The next set of photos showed Marielle entering that same kitchen at 3 a.m, night after night, for 8 long months. 8 months, 240 nights, one woman standing in the dark with a bottle of truth. I could almost smell the faint scent of her 3 a.m. coffee lingering on the yellowed pages of the binder. Marielle would painstakingly swap the sugar pills back for real medication she had procured through an offshore pharmacy. I read her notes about the bone-deep exhaustion she endured staying awake until the house was dead silent, just to ensure my heart didn't stop in my sleep. I watched my daughter try to kill you 300 times, and 300 times I chose you, her letter, confessed. Every pill I placed back in that tray was a minute I stole from death. To keep the children from trying a more violent method, Marielle had intentionally left a fake diary entry where she complained about my declining health, leading them to believe their sabotage was working. She was playing a high-stakes game of pretend with my life as the ante. The cold plastic feel of the pill organizer in the photos felt like a phantom weight in my own hands. I realized the sheer physical and emotional toll it must have taken on her to play the villain by day and my guardian angel by night. I turned to the 2014 folder, but the first thing I saw wasn't a letter. It was a hospital wristband with my name on it, stained with a single dry drop of blood. The hospital identification band felt brittle in my hand, its thin plastic cracking softly as I touched it, just as my health had cracked on that freezing morning in February of 2014. I stood in the quiet sanctuary study, holding the jagged strip between my fingers, while the ghostly scent of antiseptic seemed to rise from memory and sting my nose. That day had never left me. It remained lodged in my mind like a shard of broken glass. I could still see the Madison Park kitchen clearly. Pale winter light spilled through the tall windows, washing the room in a dull gray glow. I had walked in that morning, intending to do something as simple, pour a cup of coffee before starting the day. Then the world tilted. A metallic taste flooded my mouth, sharp and unmistakable. I knew that taste instantly. In my years inspecting bridges, I had learned to recognize early signs of danger. The copper bitterness spreading across my tongue told me something terrible was happening inside my body. A transient ischemic attack. A mini stroke. Within seconds, the left side of my body turned numb and heavy, as though gravity itself had doubled on that half of me. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers and shattered against the stone tile floor with a violent crack that echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. I collapsed into the nearest chair, struggling to speak. My words came out slow and broken, slurring together as I tried to call for help. Marielle appeared in the doorway. I remember looking at her desperate for comfort, for urgency, anything that suggested panic, but her face was perfectly still, cold, unmoved. She didn't rush forward. She didn't cry out. Instead, she watched me with a detached calm and remarked that I had made quite a mess on the kitchen tile. Her voice was dry and quiet, like autumn leaves scraping across pavement. The deepest wound that morning wasn't the stroke. It was the loneliness of her gaze. Moments later, Cade stepped into the room behind her. I believed then that he was calling emergency services, that he had grabbed his phone to dial 911. But the documents in Marielle's folder told a different story. Cade had deliberately delayed the call. 3 minutes. He pretended to be discussing a work emergency while I lay there struggling for air. Those extra seconds weren't hesitation. They were calculation. He wanted time itself to finish the job. Now, reading Marielle's February 2014 letter in the sanctuary study, my fingers traced the faint smudges on the page where her tears had once blurred the ink. She wrote that morning nearly broke her resolve. Every instinct had urged her to run to me, to hold me, to abandon the cruel role she had been playing for decades. But then she saw Cade standing partly hidden in the dining room. He wasn't holding a phone. He was holding a stopwatch. A stopwatch. My son had been timing my stroke as if it were a race on a track field. He wasn't hoping the paramedics would arrive in time to save me. He was measuring how long my body could endure the delay. Marielle confessed that the stroke itself happened because she had missed something important the night before. For years, she had secretly monitored my medication, checking every bottle to make sure the pills hadn't been tampered with. But that evening, she had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. Her own illness had begun to take hold. Stage 4 cancer. The fever and weakness from the disease had prevented her from catching a single pill swap. That was the day I stopped being their mother and became their judge, she wrote. The line struck me with quiet devastation. How does a woman grieve children who are still alive? Children who sit at her dinner table while knowing she may one day have to destroy them to save her husband. Her letter read like a eulogy, written for the living. In that moment, Marielle realized something terrible. Her children were no longer redeemable. They had become people who viewed their father's death as a timed event. From that day forward, the tone of her letters changed. They became Blueprint's plans to complete the sanctuary and transform this island into a permanent refuge before her strength faded. She began cancer treatment secretly that same February, knowing her own time was now shorter than she had hoped. While I lay recovering in a sterile hospital ward, she had been fighting 2 different wars at once, mine and her own. I turned to the folder labeled October 2017, expecting more of her protective writings. Instead, I found a legal summons, thick, cold, a weapon made of paper and ink. The children hadn't even waited for Marielle to die before making their next move. They had already begun trying to bury me in court. The legal summons was thick, a weapon of paper and ink designed to strip me of my name and my freedom while Marielle was still fighting for her last breaths. I turned the dry papery sheets with a hand that shook from a mix of indignation and a lingering bitter taste in the back of my throat. It was October 2017. I remembered the Madison Park mansion feeling like a siege camp. My 4 stepchildren, Cade, Leona, Maddox, and Sloan, had presented a unified front filing to have me declared legally incompetent. They used my previous mini-stroke and my choice to withdraw from social circles as evidence of a mounting dementia. In their predatory math, my devotion to Marielle's bedside was nothing more than the wandering mind of a senile old man. I discovered a deeper rot in the binder. The children had actually tried to bribe Marielle's hospice nurse to testify that I was neglectful and abusive during her final days. The betrayal felt like a fresh wound. "We are just doing this for your own protection," Callum Cade had said during one of those staged visits. "You can't even remember where you put the car keys." I had looked him in the eye, my voice as steely as the bridges I used to inspect, and told him that I hadn't lost the keys, but that his mother had sold the truck. Have you ever seen a dying woman summon the strength of a hurricane just to sign a piece of paper that would save your soul? The binder contained a transcript of a secret deposition Marielle gave from her hospital bed just 3 weeks before she died. In the quiet sanctuary study, I could almost smell the sharp clinical tang of hospital-grade disinfectant as I read her words. She was gaunt, her body failing, but her mind was the sharpest blade in the room. She provided the judge with everything: the SD cards of the staircase oiling the mechanics' reports of the cut brake lines and the medical logs of the sugar pill swaps. She didn't just defend me, she dismantled them. My husband is the most stable structure in this family, she had testified, with Alaric Prescott at her side. My children are the ones with the rot in their foundations. Incompetent, that was the word they used. But it was their greed that lacked a brain. The judge had dismissed the case in a closed-door hearing, noting the suspicious activity of the petitioners. Marielle's testimony was her final act as their mother. She claimed she was protecting them from the crime of destroying a good man, though I saw it for what it truly was, a death blow to their aspirations. The realization hit me with a profound solemnity. Marielle had used her final agonizing months to ensure my legal standing was ironclad. She revealed in the binder that the conservatorship battle was the exact trigger she needed to legally freeze their trust funds. By proving their attempted fraud, she initiated a mandatory ethics audit that would keep their inheritances tied up in red tape for years. She had left them the money, but she had taken away their ability to touch it. I turned to the final folder, March 2021, and found a handwritten note that simply said, "Callum, I've left you the weapon. Now you must decide if you have the heart to fire it." The final folder was thin, containing only a single sheet of paper, and a small black USB drive, the hardware for a vengeance I wasn't sure I wanted to claim. I broke the seal of the March 2021 folder, with a hand that had finally stopped shaking, replaced by a steely, quiet resolve. I inserted the drive into the laptop on the mahogany desk, and the soft hum of the machine felt like the heartbeat of the house. A video file sat at the top of the directory. I clicked it, and suddenly Marielle was there, vibrant and whole, recorded on a final ordinary day just weeks before the end. She wasn't the cold matriarch or the dying patient. She was the woman I had married, her eyes bright with a love she had spent 35 years masking. She spoke directly to the camera, telling me that she never lost her memory of us, not for a single second. It was the ultimate entry twist to my new reality. The long con hadn't just been a legal shield, but a living sacrifice. I turned my attention to the last letter, the 420th installment of her silent vigil. She dropped every defense, pouring out her reasons for the decades of calculated cruelty. She asked for my forgiveness for the years of silence that had felt like a slow-motion execution. The USB drive, she explained, was the master key. It held the access codes to the children's frozen trusts and the compiled evidence of their crimes, the staircase sabotage, the brake lines, the pill swaps. "Be free, Callum." Her steady signature seemed to pulse on the page. "I've built the walls, but you are the one who decides who gets to walk through the gate. I loved you in every silence, in every cold glance, and in every letter I hid from the world. The 420 letters were the bricks of a fortress I hadn't known I lived in until the roof was finished. I sat on the hard oak floor, leaning my back against the mahogany desk, as the warm golden light of the island dawn began to creep across the room. The smell of old paper mixed with the fresh, salt-tinged sea air, blowing in through the cracked window. Free. Not from the house, not from the children. Free from the lie. 35 years of believing I was a burden, a butler, a mistake, all of it dissolved into a profound, bone-deep peace. I wasn't a victim of a cruel wife. I was the protected treasure of a brilliant one. "You didn't leave me, Marielle," I whispered into the morning light. "You just went ahead to finish the bridge." I realized that by giving me the master key, she had performed one final power reversal. I was now the sole trustee of the children's lives. I held the power to decide if they ever saw a single penny of the Whitmore fortune again, or if they spent their remaining years answering for the blood they tried to spill. The weight of 3 decades of confusion was gone, replaced by a serenity so absolute it felt like a foundation beneath my legs. The world was quiet, the only sound the distant rhythm of the waves hitting the cliffs below. As the light hit the binders, turning their white spines into a wall of gold, I saw a small, red light blinking on the study's intercom, a signal from the front gate that someone had just breached the perimeter. The intercom buzzed again, a sharp mechanical sound that sliced through the quiet of the sanctuary. It was the first real silence I had experienced in nearly half a lifetime, and the interruption felt almost insulting. I ignored the intercom. Instead, I turned back to the computer and opened the offshore server link Marielle had left for me. A new window appeared on the screen, offering a cold digital view into Seattle. Through it, I watched the people I had once called family slowly begin to destroy one another. The only light in the dark study came from the blue glow of the monitor as I scrolled through the carefully organized archive Marielle had prepared. File after file documented the children's movements during the weeks following her funeral. It didn't take long to see the truth. Even before the ink on Marielle's will had fully dried, the siblings were already fighting among themselves. Their unity, the same unity they had displayed during the inheritance meeting, had been nothing more than a fragile performance. Behind closed doors, they were tearing at each other like animals. One recording caught my attention. It had been taken at a luxury steakhouse in downtown Seattle only 4 days after Marielle was buried. On the screen, Cade sat at the head of the table, leaning back comfortably in his chair. A glass of wine that cost nearly $5,000 rested in his hand, while a cloud of cigar smoke drifted through the air above them. He raised the glass with theatrical enthusiasm. "To freedom," he said loudly, laughing, as he tossed a set of keys across the table. The keys belonged to a Lamborghini he had just purchased on Sierra credit, $500,000 spent before the inheritance had even been finalized. Maddox leaned forward with a sneer. "I hope the old man enjoys canned soup on that island dump," he said, drawing laughter from the table. Leona lifted her glass next, to finally cutting loose the dead weight. The scene was grotesque. Their celebration resembled a gathering of vultures circling what they believed was a finished kill. A Lamborghini. $1 million gambling line, $5,000 bottles of wine, all of it built on the fragile illusion of wealth that Marielle had carefully left for them. The footage shifted to a later recording, taken inside the Madison Park Mansion's library several weeks afterward. The atmosphere had changed completely. The laughter was gone. In its place, the room pulsed with tension, illuminated by the red blinking light of an incoming financial alert on the table. Cade's face darkened with rage as Alaric Prescott's voice came through the speakerphone. He was informing them that their primary trust accounts had been flagged for an ethics investigation. The celebration had collapsed into chaos. Maddox lost his temper first. He hurled a crystal glass across the room, where it shattered against the stone fireplace in a sharp explosion of sound. Moments later, he learned that the $1 million credit line he had opened in Las Vegas had been suspended. Across the room, Sloane sat trembling in a chair, struggling to breathe, as she discovered that a cryptocurrency scheme had wiped out the remainder of her available savings. It was the sound of predators discovering the trap had closed around them. They shouted at Alaric through the phone, demanding explanations. None of them understood how their accounts could suddenly be frozen under a conduct review. What they failed to realize was that Marielle had anticipated everything. She had built a financial cage using their own greed as the bars. "Mother would never do this," Sloane cried desperately, glancing around the room, as if searching for an escape. That bridge inspector must have manipulated her at the end. They still couldn't see the truth. Their downfall had been entirely their own creation. The final log revealed their last desperate move. Only a week earlier, Cade had attempted to forge a codicil to Marielle's will, hoping to reclaim the assets she had placed beyond their reach. But Marielle's system had been designed to detect tampering instantly. The forgery triggered an automatic report to the ethics board before Cade even finished submitting the document. As the video loop returned to their earlier celebration at the steakhouse, a new notification flashed across my screen. A GPS alert. A rental van had just exited the ferry ramp on Orcas Island. It was only 3 miles from the sanctuary. The vultures were coming, but they were no longer arriving to celebrate a victory. They were coming to beg. The phone on the desk rang its vibration, rattling the binders like a warning bell. I didn't need to answer it to know that the calm of Orcas Island was about to be shattered by the frantic heartbeat of 4 desperate Whitmore heirs. I reached out my fingers, brushing the cool spine of the March 2021 binder before I finally picked up the receiver. Saskia's voice was a low rasp on the other end, urgent and cutting through the hum of the security monitors. She confirmed what the GPS had already whispered: the rental van was carrying Cade, Leona, Maddox, and Sloane. They looked frantic and disheveled at the ferry landing. She told me, describing them as people who had been sleeping in their suits, their former Polish stripped away by the cold reality of frozen accounts. Saskia warned me that they weren't here for a tearful reunion. They had hired a local locksmith and a private security guard to force their way into what they still believed was a squalid island ruin. A small, steely smile touched my lips when she mentioned the locksmith. I discovered that the man they had hired was actually Saskia's own nephew, meaning I would have full knowledge of their every clumsy move before they even touched the lock. "Let them come, Saskia," I said, my voice as steady as the fieldstone walls surrounding me. The gates were built for exactly this kind of weather. I hung up and sipped my peppermint tea, the warmth a sharp contrast to the gray, choppy sea visible through the study window. I moved with a calm I hadn't possessed 40 years ago, transitioning from the observer to the architect of their final lesson. I used the estate's command console to activate the internal security protocols. Marielle had meticulously designed the smell of ozone from the monitors filling the room. I didn't prepare a weapon. I prepared the truth. I gathered the insurance folders, the physical evidence of the oiled stairs, the severed brake lines, and the swapped pills, and carried them downstairs. The Whitmore children were like floodwaters, mindless, destructive, and looking for the easiest way to drown anything of value. I placed the folders meticulously on the dining room table, the cold, smooth feel of the cardstock, a reminder of the weight they carried. I arranged the chairs so that I would be framed by the massive stone fireplace, assuming the role of the Judge Marielle always knew I could be. It was time to show them what adequate compensation really looks like. 45 years of bridge inspection had taught me one thing: you can't hide a structural failure forever. Disheveled, desperate, debt-ridden. The 3 Ds of a Whitmore downfall were about to collide with the one thing they couldn't buy or bully my memory. As I sat there, the vibration of the heavy stone walls signaled the van's approach. I checked the forest surveillance feed one last time. Cade was leading the pack, clutching a heavy document tube against his chest. I realized then that they weren't just here to squat in a house. They had forged a new deed to the property, a final desperate paper shield against their own ruin. I watched the monitors as the white rental van turned onto Oakwood Lane, the dust cloud behind it, rising like a signal fire for the war that was finally arriving at my door. I stood up adjusting my collar and walked toward the porch to meet the storm. I didn't hide in the shadows. I walked onto the porch and sat in Marielle's high-backed wicker chair, letting the island sun hit my face as the gates groaned open like the jaws of a trap. The rhythmic creak of the wicker under my weight was the only sound in the sudden stillness of the afternoon. I didn't reach for a weapon or a phone. Instead, I placed a small side table next to my chair with a single glass of water and the black USB drive. I had already wired the porch for sound and video, and as I sat there, I knew that every word and every movement was being broadcast directly to Alaric Prescott's legal server as a live, indelible deposition. I watched the white rental van crawl up the quarter-mile driveway, its engine struggling and whining against the steep incline. It was a perfect metaphor for the Whitmore name straining overheating and ultimately failing against a foundation it could no longer dominate. For 45 years, I had been the man who inspected the bridges while others walked across them. Today, I was the only one who truly belonged on this soil. Just like inspecting a bridge, I told myself you wait for the tension to snap before you call the failure. They think they're coming home, but they're just walking into a courtroom. I took a slow, cold sip of the water, letting the refreshing liquid steady my pulse. I could see the dust cloud rising in the distance, a white shroud for the life they thought they were reclaiming. Before I reveal the truth behind the document tube Kate is clutching, are you still with me? Comment 1, if you think I should show them mercy, or 2 if you believe the evidence should destroy them. Add 1 short reason so I can understand your perspective. Please note, what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes, as the core message is what I hope stays with you. The van door slid open. The smell of fear and cheap fast food followed them out. The Whitmores had arrived. They emerged like actors from a low-rent tragedy, their expensive suits wrinkled and stained from the journey. Cade Whitmore took the lead, his face already turning a familiar, arrogant shade of red as he spotted me sitting above him. He was clutching that heavy document tube as if it were a scepter, his knuckles white. Behind him, Leona and Maddox looked like ghosts of their former selves, while Sloane hung back, her hand gripped tightly around a small, concealed pepper spray canister. They had come prepared for a fight, but they weren't prepared for the man waiting for them. "You've had your little vacation," Callum Cade barked, stopping at the foot of the stairs. "Now get your bags and get off our property." Leona sneered, looking around at the meticulously kept grounds with a confusion that was rapidly turning into fresh greed. "Look at him," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "sitting there like he's the king of the island. It's pathetic." I didn't stand up. I didn't even blink. Cade took the first step onto the porch, his eyes locking onto the USB drive on the table, and for a second, I saw the exact moment he realized he wasn't looking at a victim, but at a man holding the detonator. I didn't rise to greet them. I remained seated in Marielle's chair, my posture still and unmoving, watching the certainty drain from Cade's face the moment he realized my silence was something he could not intimidate or control. I didn't stand. I didn't even blink. From where I sat, I watched his polished shoe step onto the first stone stair, leading to the sanctuary. The leather was scuffed now, the edges stained with salt from the long ferry ride. For a man who once walked into every room believing he owned it, the hesitation in that single step spoke volumes. Maddox, ever quick to sense opportunity, shoved past Cade before he could recover. He forced a strained smile onto his face, the kind that pretends to be regret, but carries the scent of calculation. "Callum, Dad, listen," he said, his voice trembling as he stepped closer. "Things got heated in the city. Everyone was grieving. We were confused." His words rushed out clumsily like a salesman trying to salvage a collapsing deal. "We just want to talk about Mom's real wishes." He stretched his arms forward as if preparing for a hug, performing the gesture of family reconciliation for cameras he believed might be watching. I stepped aside smoothly, avoiding him, with the ease of someone sidestepping a structural hazard on a bridge inspection. Maddox stumbled forward awkwardly. As he tried to regain his balance, something slipped from the inside of his jacket and struck the wooden porch with a metallic clatter, a small silver recording device. The sight of it almost made me laugh. Have you ever heard a man apologize with his mouth while his eyes quietly measure the value of your watch? I didn't answer him. Instead, I let the distant roar of the Pacific waves fill the silence between us. The wind off the water carried that sound through the trees, and my steady gaze never left Maddox's face. Behind him, the other siblings lingered in uneasy formation. Cade's irritation had hardened into something darker. Leona looked disgusted by Maddox's display. Yet beneath her anger, a flicker of fear had begun to grow. My silence was dismantling them. "Can't we start over?" Maddox asked again, his voice cracking under the strain. For the sake of family, silence remained my only response. It was sharper than any insult. At last I moved, not with anger, but with quiet precision. I reached to the small side table beside Marielle's chair and lifted a black USB drive from its surface. Only then did I stand slowly and deliberately, as though I owned every inch of the cliffside beneath the house. Cade's document tube rested uselessly in his hands. Leona muttered something bitter under her breath. I ignored both of them. "Inside," I said calmly. My voice carried an authority they had never heard from me before. "All of you." I gestured toward the heavy oak door and walked ahead without waiting for permission. Behind me, their footsteps followed reluctantly as they entered the house. The moment they crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed. This was not the neglected ruin they had described to their lawyers back in Seattle. The house stood immaculate polished wood, gleaming beneath warm lighting. The air carried Marielle's familiar perfume, a faint floral scent, that lingered like a quiet presence watching everything unfold. Their confidence faltered immediately. "Is that a photo of him from last year?" Leona whispered, staring at the wall. Hundreds of framed photographs lined the hallway, snapshots of my life Marielle had carefully preserved. "How long has she been hiding this place?" she asked, her voice thin with disbelief. They walked deeper into the house, breathing harder, now their expensive clothing wrinkled and stained from travel. Against the elegance of the estate, they looked strangely out of place. The failure clung to them like sea salt. I stopped at the end of the hallway. In my hand, the silver key felt cool and smooth against my palm. I placed it in the lock of the study door. The click echoed sharply through the corridor, as loud and final as a gunshot. 4 pairs of eyes fixed on me as I pushed the door open. Inside waited the center of Marielle's design. The study remained exactly as I had left it. 420 binders stood in silent rows across the walls. 420 records of truth, facing 4 people built entirely on lies. The study didn't just hold binders. It held the ghosts of the nights my children tried to kill me, and as the lights flickered on, those ghosts finally stepped into the light. I opened the heavy oak door and gestured for the siblings to enter the center of Marielle's secrets. They moved tentatively, their frantic energy curdling into a heavy, suffocating dread. I walked behind the mahogany desk, the leather chair creaking as I sat, assuming the role of the judge Marielle always knew I could be. I gestured to the wall of 420 binders, their white spines standing like a jury in the dim light. "You thought the house was the inheritance, Cade," I said, my voice cutting through their heavy breathing. "These folders are your real legacy." I picked up the insurance folders and began to methodically lay them out on the desk like a hand of cards. The sound of paper sliding across the wood sharpened the silence. My fingers brushed the cool surface of the black USB drive, a reminder of the power I now held. The entry twist hit them first. I turned over a file showing not just their attacks on me, but evidence of them plotting against each other to increase their individual shares. Maddox blanched as he saw a transcript of Leona suggesting he be handled if he didn't stop gambling away their future. They crowded around the desk, their initial arrogance dissolving into a cold, metallic sweat. Evidence, not just ink and paper, the scent of my own near-death bound in leather. Is that the oil can I used in 2010? Maddox whispered, his eyes bulging as he stared at a high-resolution photo. How did she find it? I didn't answer him. Instead, I activated the wall monitor, the blue light reflecting off their pale, terrified faces. I played the clip of Maddox applying the lubricant to the stairs, followed by the mechanic's report on the cut brake lines and the lab results of Sloane's sugar pill swap. Look at their faces. Can you see it? That's the look of 4 people realizing they've spent 30 years hunting a man who was already holding the keys to their prison cells. Each act, attempted murder, elder abuse forgery, carried a weight that would bury them. I explained that Marielle had already filed these with a maritime legal server. It would automatically release the evidence to the district attorney if I didn't enter a safety code every 48 hours. "You didn't just want the money, Sloane," I said, looking at her as she trembled. "You wanted to watch me stop breathing." I turned to Cade, who was still clutching his document tube. I informed him that the property he tried to claim was classified as a conservation sanctuary. It could never be sold for development, rendering his forged deed a worthless scrap of paper, even if he succeeded in removing me. Marielle wasn't just a CEO, I told them, my voice cold and absolute. She was a bridge inspector just like me. She found every crack in your souls. The siblings stood in paralyzed silence, the reality of their exposure sinking in like stones in a lake. I closed the last folder and looked at Cade, whose face had gone from the red of rage to the gray of a man who had just seen his own executioner smile. The silence in the study was no longer a peace. It was a gallows. "Do you know what the structural load of a lie is?" I asked, my voice cutting through the sound of Cade's heavy, panicked breathing. I leaned back in Marielle's chair, watching as the four of them stood huddled together like cattle in a storm. On the wall monitor, a digital progress bar pulsed blue, a live upload of the USB drive to Alaric's offshore legal server. "The state of Washington calls what you did first-degree murder attempt," I said with a calmness that seemed to terrify them more than a scream. "I call it a failure of character." I watched the document tube Cade had been clutching like a scepter hit the floor with a hollow plastic thud. "Mother wouldn't," he croaked, his voice cracking like dry wood. "She wouldn't send us to prison." I didn't blink. "She didn't want you in cages, Cade, but she wouldn't allow you to remain as you are." I revealed the first blow of their new reality. I had already used the master key to settle their immediate predatory debts. I was now their sole creditor. I owned their mortgages, their credit lines, and their very financial existence. They didn't even have the luxury of bankruptcy. They owed their lives to the man they tried to erase. $20 an hour, from a Lamborghini to a shovel. That is the Whitmore exchange rate today. I laid the redemption contract on the desk, the paper cold and dry under the study lights. The terms were absolute. "Cade, you will surrender yourself for a pre-negotiated 4-year sentence for the brake line tampering. You'll be a paralegal for the indigent behind bars using the law to help someone other than yourself. Maddox, you'll work the island's construction projects for minimum wage while maintaining strict tested sobriety. Leona and Sloan, you will manage the farm and the future shelter. You will live in the worker cottages at the base of the hill, stripped of your designers and your status. Look at them. They came here to take a house, and they're leaving with a job. Mercy is the heaviest thing I've ever had to carry." I took a final sip of the iron-heavy island water, the taste grounding me in the present. "If there is any deviation," I warned, "if I see one sign of the old greed or a single step out of line, the stay on the legal upload is removed. You will face 25 years to life." Mother's parents, the ones who taught you these games, died penniless because Marielle drained their accounts years ago to fund this very sanctuary. She knew the rot went back 2 generations, and she cut it out at the root. Sloane's cloying, expensive perfume seemed to fade in the stale air of the room, replaced by the scent of old paper and the reality of hard labor. "You will earn $20 an hour," I repeated. "You will sweat, you will bleed, and you will thank me for the opportunity to become human again." They stared at me in a state of total submission, the shock of their transition from heirs to laborers finally settling into their bones. I stood up and slid the USB drive toward the center of the desk, the small black piece of plastic looking like a hand grenade with the pin halfway pulled. I waited for the first of them to break, for the first confession to crack the silence of the room. The room was so quiet I could hear the gears of the antique clock on the mantel each tick a second of their old lives slipping away. I stood up and slid the USB drive toward the center of the desk, the small black piece of plastic looking like a hand grenade with the pin halfway pulled. Sloan was the first to snap. The sound of her designer heels hitting the floor as she fell to her knees was the most honest thing I'd heard in this house since Marielle's heart stopped. She broke down into hysterical, ugly sobs, her cloying perfume mixing with a sharp scent of salt and genuine terror. "I didn't want to do it," she wailed, her hands clutching at the mahogany edge of my desk. "Cade said it was the only way to save our shares. He said you were just an obstacle." She admitted through gasps of air that her failed resort development had left her so debt-ridden that the thought of poverty had overridden her soul. I watched her with a mixture of pity and a strange clinical detachment. Behind her, Cade, Maddox, and Leona recoiled. They weren't disgusted by her betrayal of me, but by her weakness in breaking the family's wall of silence. "Look at you, Sloan." Cade hissed, his face a mask of predatory contempt. "You're pathetic." We were this close to the deed. I let the silence stretch, watching the digital upload, complete bar glow blue on the wall monitor. Have you ever seen a king realize his crown was made of cardboard? While his kingdom burned around him, Cade's eyes darted toward the monitor, then back to the contract on my desk. The transition was visceral. Maddox, sensing the finality of the trap, chose that moment to reveal his own hidden insurance. He pulled a phone from his pocket, explaining that he had been recording Cade's private admissions of fraud and brake-line sabotage for months, just in case he needed leverage. The siblings were no longer a unit. They were a pile of dry timber, and I was the match. One by one, they realized the forged deed was a worthless scrap of paper against the weight of the folders I had laid out. The pen, a simple plastic bic, might as well have been a death warrant for the people they used to be. Cade was the last to yield. His hands shook with a violent tremor as he picked up the pen to sign the redemption contract. By signing, he accepted a 4-year prison term for the truck sabotage while his siblings bound themselves to the island's labor. "You're a monster, Callum." He spat the ink, scratching harshly against the heavy paper. "Worse than mother." I met his gaze with the calm of a man who had seen every bridge failure imaginable. "No, Kate," I said. "I'm just the inspector, and your foundation just failed." As they each added their signatures, the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting long purple shadows into the study. The hierarchy had been permanently inverted. I informed them that their phone signals had been jammed since they crossed the gate of final security layer Marielle had insisted upon. They were completely cut off, isolated from the world, and the lawyers they thought would save them. The orange and purple light of the sunset reflected off the picture frames of my life, a silent audience to their downfall. I stood on the porch as the 4 people I had raised walked toward the small worker cottages in the dark, the first frost of autumn beginning to bite at the air they now had to earn. Winter on Orcas Island doesn't just bite the skin, it gnaws at the ego, stripping away the designer labels until all that's left is the raw, shivering truth of survival. The first morning in the cottages was silent, save for the sound of a wood-burning stove, and the realization that their old lives were gone. I watched from the main house as the frost of November turned the emerald forest into a skeletal silver graveyard. My stepchildren emerged from their dwellings not in Italian wool or silk, but in the generic heavy-duty canvas and denim I had purchased from the island's local hardware shop. I had already made a trip to the mainland to donate their confiscated wardrobes to a local thrift store, ensuring that the only remnants of their corporate royalty were the blisters beginning to form on their soft palms. Maddox and Leona were assigned to the construction site under the watchful eye of Saskia's lead foreman. Maddox, a man who once managed hedge funds with the flick of a finger, was now tasked with clearing rocky debris for the new shelter's foundation in the freezing mud. I could see the steam rising from his breath as he struggled with a rusted wheelbarrow. "My hands are bleeding! Callum!" he shouted across the yard when he saw me. "This is inhumane!" I didn't move from my post. "Pain is just your body's way of remembering it's alive, Maddox. Keep digging." The work log was the only thing standing between him and a felony indictment, and we both knew it. $20 an hour. Maddox used to lose that much in the time it took him to sneeze. Now he was earning it through the honest friction of stone against steel. Down at the farm, Leona was winterizing the greenhouses, hauling heavy bags of compost through a wind that carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Her initial attempts at rebellion, throwing down her shovel and demanding a lawyer, were met only with my stony silence. Cade was already gone, processed into a state facility 2 days prior, and his absence hung over the grounds like a warning that needed no translation. By December, the freezing rain turned to a biting crystalline sleet. I sat on the porch wrapped in a heavy wool coat, serving hot tea to the local plumber and a pair of carpenters. We spoke of bridge tolerances and island politics, while my stepchildren ate their lunch of simple vegetable soup huddled together in the mud, like refugees from a world they no longer recognized. "I saw you drinking tea with the plumber," Callum Leona hissed as she walked past to empty a bucket. "Have you no dignity?" I took a slow sip of the hot liquid, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. "He's built more bridges than you've ever seen, Leona. Right now, he's the only one in this yard with any real value. Their arrogance was a structure with a failed foundation, and the island winter was the seismic event that would finally bring it down." I watched the psychological toll manifest in their slumped shoulders and the way they stopped looking at the horizon and started looking at their feet. Habit, however, is a resilient weed. During a routine check of the cottages, I found a hidden stash of expensive scotch tucked behind a loose floorboard in Maddox's room. I walked out into the yard and poured the amber liquid into the fresh snow, watching it freeze into a bitter ice. I looked up at the sky just as the first scream of the winter gale hit the windows, knowing the storm was only beginning. The snow piled up against the study glass, a white wall that felt like the final page of their old lives turning. Sloane didn't walk into the study with the clicking heels of a predator anymore. She walked with the heavy, silent tread of someone who had spent the last month counting her own sins in the dark. I watched her from my desk, noting the smell of cold, damp wool and the cheap institutional soap provided to the cottages that now clung to her skin. Her designer complexion had gone pale. Her hands were visibly calloused from weeks of greenhouse labor, and the arrogance in her eyes had been replaced by a hollow, searching look. Before she sat, I noticed a smudge of fresh soil on her knees. I had discovered earlier that morning that Sloane had been secretly using her limited free time to tend to Marielle's memorial garden in the freezing mist. It wasn't an assignment, it was a form of private penance I hadn't expected. I sat in the corner of the room, a silent witness to her court-mandated teletherapy session. The blue flickering light of the laptop screen illuminated her red-rimmed, unmasked eyes as Dr. Aris, a clinical specialist from Seattle, began the interrogation. "I wasn't trying to kill him," Dr. Sloan whispered, her fingers picking at the rough fabric of her work trousers. "I just needed the timeline to move faster. The Whitmore legacy. It was everything." The doctor's voice was a sharp contrast to the wind whistling through the study's eaves. "You were managing a death clock, Sloan. Own the term. Apologies are like bridge supports. If they aren't anchored in truth, they're just expensive pieces of junk waiting to collapse under pressure." I watched Sloan flinch at the words. She tried to deflect, pointing the finger at Cade's intimidation and the crushing pressure of her mother's expectations. But the doctor remained unyielding. For the first time, Sloan had no PR spin to hide behind. The silence that followed the end of the call was absolute, broken only by the settling of the house. She cried. Not the "I'm caught" cry. The "I'm empty" cry. She sat there for a long time, her calloused fingers gripping the edges of the wooden chair until her knuckles turned white. "Callum," she said, her voice small and devoid of its usual silver edge. "I remember 1977. I remember when you fixed that broken porcelain doll after Cade threw it down the stairs. I haven't thought about that in years. I realized I can't remember the last time I felt like a human being instead of a shareholder." She looked at me, then her gaze direct and raw. "I'm not saying this so you'll let me leave. I'm saying it because I'm sorry. Not for the loss of the money, for the pills. For thinking you were less than us because you worked with your hands." It was the first real word spoken by a Whitmore child in decades. A clumsy, unpolished admission that felt heavier than any legal document. But then her expression shifted, a flicker of the old fear returning. "Leona and Maddox. They aren't like me, Callum. They're planning to steal the USB drive during the spring thaw. They think if they destroy the evidence, the audit stops." I watched her walk back into the snow, her warning about the USB drive echoing in the quiet study, like the first creak of a failing timber. My heart was wary, but for the first time since I arrived on this island, it was also slightly hopeful. The first thaw began with a sound like a gunshot, ice breaking on the sound, and the brothers' patience breaking in the cottages. I watched through the mud-spattered lens of the sight camera as Maddox Whitmore, a man who once wouldn't ruin a $5,000 suit to save his own mother, dived shoulder-deep into the freezing, slush to keep a concrete form from collapsing on a fellow worker. I had intentionally let Maddox find a bottle of bourbon earlier in the winter as a stress test, knowing that for a man like him, sobriety had to be a chosen fortress, not a mandated cage. He hadn't touched it yet, but the real trial arrived with the shifting earth. A sudden violent groan of wood echoed across the site as a support timber splintered like a dry bone. Caleb, a 19-year-old islander with dirt-smudged cheeks and the sturdy build of a lifelong fisherman, looked at Maddox with a terror that only a collapsing trench can inspire. The boy was pinned, the weight of the thawing, iron-rich mud threatening to crush his lungs. Maddox didn't hesitate. He grabbed a crowbar and threw his entire physical being against the failing brace. "Don't let go!" Whitmore, the foreman, screamed as the trench walls shuddered. "If that timber slips, he's gone." Maddox's face was a mask of agonizing effort, his veins bulging as he fought the laws of physics. "I've got him," he grunted through clenched teeth. "Just get the damn jack and move sweat, blood, mud." The Whitmore trio of failure was finally being replaced by the Whitmore trio of labor. By the time I arrived on the scene, Caleb had been pulled free, and Maddox was slumped against the foundation covered in filth, with a deep bleeding gash on his forearm. He looked more present, more anchored to the earth than I had seen him in 30 years. "You did good, Maddox," I said, watching, as Caleb's father stepped forward to shake his hand. "Your hands, they finally look like they've done a day's work." The gratitude he received wasn't the polite plastic variety bought with a donation. It was earned in the dirt. Can a man rebuild his soul with the same hands he used to try and dismantle his father's life? That evening, the smell of wet concrete clung to the air as Maddox retreated to his cottage. He was exhausted, every muscle a screaming reminder of his exertion. I watched through the window as he reached into the shadows for the hidden bourbon, his fingers trembling with the onset of withdrawal. He caught his reflection in the mirror, the mud and Caleb's blood still streaked across his skin. He stopped. "I don't need the ghost in the bottle to tell me who I am today," he whispered to the empty room. Caleb's father thanked me. He actually shook my hand. In a private, silent moment of transformation, he walked to the sink. The sharp, stinging scent of cheap bourbon hit the porcelain as he poured the amber liquid down the drain, accepting the tremors as the price of a real future. He was finally choosing the man over the air, but the peace was short-lived. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled note Leona had slipped under his door during the chaos of the accident. It detailed a plan to sabotage the security server, tonight a final desperate play for the drive. Maddox clutched Leona's note in his trembling, sober hand, the sound of the server room alarm suddenly echoing across the dark courtyard. The red strobe of the alarm cut through the mist, a warning light that the peace I'd built for the winter was officially over. I watched Leona through the study window as she knelt in the mud of the Victoria garden, her hands once manicured to a porcelain sheen, now stained with the dark, honest soil of Orcas Island. The alarm had faded into the quiet of a late spring morning, leaving behind a residue of cold clarity. Weeks ago, during that frantic server room incident, Leona had attempted to bypass the encryption to delete the evidence of her forgery. She had expected a digital firewall or a lockout. Instead, the system had simply displayed a high-definition video of Marielle's final days. My wife had spent her last breaths looking into that camera, and Leona found herself staring into the silent, hollow eyes of the mother she had tried to defraud. The psychological weight of that gaze broke her more effectively than any prison sentence. "I didn't want the money tonight, Callum," she had whispered when I found her trembling in the server rack's blue glow. "I just wanted her to stop looking at me like that." I had told her then to stop giving her a reason to look away. I assigned her to the Victoria Garden, a plot of land named after Marielle's mother, the very woman who had planted the seeds of greed in the Whitmore bloodline. Leona was now literally weeding the legacy of the person who had ruined her family. A garden is just a slow-motion bridge. It requires the same integrity, the same constant inspection, and the same refusal to let the rot take hold. I spent the following month watching her from the porch, observing as she transformed from a predator into a caretaker. By mid-May, the garden was flourishing. I walked down the slope as the cool, wet feeling of the island mist clung to my skin, the air thick with the heavy, intoxicating smell of crushed tomato leaves and damp mulch. Leona was finishing a harvest of heirloom tomatoes and Victoria peppers, which glowed with a vibrant, almost neon violet hue against the dark earth. She didn't hear me approach at first. She was busy talking to the plants in a low, rhythmic hum that reminded me of how Marielle used to murmur to her binders in the study. "Mud. It's the great equalizer. It doesn't care about your trust fund or your pedigree." I watched the way her dirt under the nails hands moved with a newfound gentleness, cradling the produce as if it were fragile glass. "They survived the frost, Callum," she said, standing up and wiping her forehead with a soiled forearm. "I didn't think they would, but they did." I looked at the thriving rows of green and purple. "You gave them a reason to stay rooted," I replied. "That's more than most people do." She picked up the wicker basket, the wood creaking under the weight of the harvest, and turned to face me. The defiance that had defined her for 35 years had been replaced by something softer, something ancient. She held the basket out toward me, her eyes meeting mine without a hint of the old PR spin. "Here, Daddy," she said quietly. The word was more fragile than any heirloom sprout, a term of intimacy she hadn't uttered since the day the letters began in 1986. The word hung in the humid garden air, and for the first time in 3 decades, I felt the bridge between us stop swaying. I took the basket from her, the weight of the vegetables less than the weight of that single word. I left the island the next morning, the ferry crossing the Salish Sea, under a canopy of heavy gray clouds that mirrored the gravity of my destination. The buzzing of the prison's heavy magnetic locks felt like a physical assault, after a year of hearing nothing but the rhythmic breathing of the Pacific. I checked my pride at the door of the Monroe Correctional Complex and followed a guard through a series of echoing windowless hallways. I sat on a cold clinical metal chair in the visiting room, the smell of floor wax and stale coffee heavy in the stagnant air. When the door on the opposite side opened, I was struck by how much the prison uniform had erased Cade's corporate identity. Without the bespoke suits and the predatory arrogance of wealth, he looked remarkably like the young man I taught to fish in the late 70s. I discovered an entry twist of my own as I looked at him. He didn't know that I had been the one quietly paying for his legal defense and ensuring he wasn't targeted by other inmates. Continuing Marielle's tradition of silent protection, Cade didn't start the conversation with legal demands or complaints about the food. He pressed his pale, unmanicured hands against the scratched glass partition. "Do you remember the bridge in Skagit?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "The one with the green paint? Was I actually there, Callum? Or did I dream that I felt a pang of melancholy?" "You were there," I told him. "You held the tape measure while I checked the rivets. You were 7 years old. Monroe. Concrete and steel. The exact materials I spent my life inspecting. Only this time, the defect was human." He told me that, since his accounts were frozen and his circle of vultures had vanished, his only currency had been the binders I sent him, the copies of the letters Marielle had written about him. They told me you were an intruder, Aunt Callum. He confessed, his eyes searching mine through the glass. But, looking at these letters, I think I was the one who broke into your life. He asked if Marielle ever actually loved him, or if he was just another structural failure she was trying to manage. She loved the boy you were, I replied. She spent 35 years trying to find him again. Can a uniform made of coarse polyester do what a lifetime of luxury couldn't? Can it make a man look at his father and see a person instead of an obstacle? Cade looked down, his eyes welling with a repentance I never thought I'd see. He revealed a final plan of his own. He had used his time in the prison library to track the original offshore accounts his grandparents used to launder Marielle's bonuses decades ago. He intended to use his limited legal access to return every cent to the Sanctuary Trust as restitution. I walked away from the glass, the sound of the high-security fences cutting through the blue sky outside. But when I looked back, Cade wasn't watching the guards. He was staring at his own hands the same way I used to when I was trying to figure out how to bridge a gap that felt impossible. I saw the flash of the boy he had been before the greed took root, and for the first time, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man finally inspecting his own foundation. I didn't expect to see a line of cars winding up the forest road, but as the brass plaque for Victoria's Haven caught the afternoon sun, and I realized Marielle hadn't just built me a house. She'd built a legacy of survival. The golden light of the island dawn had matured into a rich, honeyed afternoon. I stood on the porch watching the first group of domestic abuse survivors arrive at the sanctuary. The redemption contract I had forced upon my stepchildren contained a final entry twist they hadn't seen coming. They would eventually inherit this land, but only as joint trustees of the nonprofit. They could live here, they could work here, but they could never sell a single acre for profit. I watched Maddox still in his dirt-stained work clothes, proudly showing a local islander the structural integrity of the newly finished wing. "The foundation is solid, Callum," he called out to me with a grin that actually reached his eyes. I checked the load-bearing beams myself. In the kitchen, Leona was busy serving a meal entirely sourced from her garden. "Mother would have liked the violet peppers," she remarked as she set the centerpiece on the long oak table. "They're the heart of the harvest today." Even Sloane moved with a quiet, humble efficiency, handling the intake logistics with a grace that replaced her old corporate fire. The siblings were finally operating as a unit of service, fulfilling the spirit of their contract for the first time in their lives. Is it possible to love the woman who broke you more than the woman who coddled you? I saw the answer in the way they looked at the house, not as a prize to be won, but as a responsibility to be maintained. As the guests departed, and the air began to carry the scent of wet cedar and salt spray, the four of us gathered on the jagged cliff edge where the Fieldstone house meets the Pacific. The sound of the waves crashing hundreds of feet below was a rhythmic grounding thrum. I brought out the simple wooden urn I had kept in my study for over a year. Gray ash, salt spray, the end of a 35-year storm. I held the urn out, and each sibling took a handful of the gritty remains. Their tears were unforced now, silver tracks on faces that had been hardened by a year of honest labor. "Go find your peace," Marielle Maddox whispered as he let his portion fly into the wind. "We've got the bridge from here. She gave us back our souls, didn't she?" Sloane asked, her voice catching on the salt-heavy breeze. I watched the white dust catch the spray and disappear into the vast, churning Salish Sea, finally completing the intent of that 420th letter. The taste of salt on the wind was sharp and clean. I felt a profound sense of closure, the weight of the past, finally sinking into the depths. But as the wind shifted, catching the very last of the remains, I felt something hard at the bottom of the wood. I reached in and found a final 421st envelope tucked into the velvet lining, a letter Marielle had hidden for the specific day she was finally scattered. It was tiny and salt-stained, but her handwriting on the front was as steady and bold as the day we met. I pulled the small message from the urn, the ink reading, "For the man who rebuilt the bridge." The final letter didn't feel like paper. It felt like a warm hand resting on my shoulder. One last tether to the woman who had spent half a century playing the villain to remain my hero. I stood alone on the jagged cliffside, the paper warm in my grip, as if it had been holding on to the heat of the afternoon sun, just for me. I broke the seal and let Marielle's voice into my mind one last time. She admitted that the hardest part of her 4-decade performance wasn't the public cruelty or the legal maneuvering, but the quiet moments in our Madison Park kitchen when she had almost given in to the urge to tell me the truth. She wrote about the connection a bridge facilitates, reminding me that the structural integrity of a family, much like the steel and stone I had spent my life inspecting, depends on the strength of its deepest foundations. I discovered an entry twist that made me weep. Marielle had maintained a second secret sanctuary fund specifically for Cade's rehabilitation, a ledger of hope proving she had never truly given up on her firstborn. Forgive me for the silence, Callum, the faded but clear ink read. I hope the island's music makes up for it. I felt a final total wave of forgiveness wash over me, not just for her, but for the man I was forced to be during those long, lonely years. You did it, Marielle, I whispered to the salt, heavy wind. You brought us all home. He didn't look like a Whitmore anymore. He looked like a man. I walked back toward the house to find a familiar figure standing on the porch. It was Cade, recently released on parole after his tireless work uncovering the laundered funds and his service as a prison paralegal. The bespoke suits and golden watches were gone, replaced by simple unbranded clothing that suggested a quiet humility. Without being asked, Cade brought out a tray with 2 ceramic mugs. He walked with a meticulously silent respect, a mirror of the very role I had held for 35 years. Black 2 sugars, he said, his voice steady as he offered me the coffee. I haven't forgotten Callum. I looked at him, seeing the strength in his eyes that had nothing to do with arrogance. How many years does it take for a son to learn that serving a good man is worth more than ruling a bad empire? He told me he wasn't here for the deed or the trust, but simply to help with the foundation of the haven. Then he delivered the final role reversal. Cade told me that he had officially and legally changed his last name. He was no longer a Whitmore. He was Cade Callum. He had chosen my identity over the toxic legacy of his mother's family, effectively crowning me as the father he finally recognized. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the morning air as the Pacific breathed against the cliffs below. I felt the warmth of the ceramic mug against my palm, grounding me in a reality I had once thought impossible. I took the cup from his hand, the steam rising between us, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a bridge inspector or a butler in the reflection. I saw a father. We sat together in silence, the steam from our cups mingling with the island mist, 2 men built on a foundation of letters. The sound of a child's laughter skipped across the stone courtyard, a bright melodic frequency that finally chased the last lingering shadows of Marielle's silence from the corners of the estate. Maya, a 5-year-old with Marielle's piercing gray eyes and a mop of unruly blonde curls, bounded across the grass with the fearless energy of someone who had never known the weight of a Whitmore secret. She carried a small decorative wooden box with a focused intensity that made me smile. Sloane had arrived with her, but it was Maya who led the way to the slope behind the Victoria Garden where we were gathering. I discovered an entry twist that Sloane had carefully arranged. The box Maya held contained a few scoops of soil from Marielle's favorite garden back in Seattle. We were here to plant a legacy orchard of Honeycrisp apple trees, one for every member of the family, and Maya wanted to mix the 2 worlds together. I watched Cade, Maddox, Leona, and Sloane pick up their shovels. They didn't argue about who had the hardest ground or who was doing more work. They moved with a synchronized rhythm that made me realize the redemption contract had finally evolved into something organic, a shared responsibility for a future they were building with their own hands. Maya tugged on my sleeve, pointing to a young sapling. Grandpa, will this tree grow as tall as the house? I knelt in the fresh, damp earth, the smell of young apple wood, sharp in the cold air. You have to pack the soil firm, Maya, I told her, guiding her small hands. A tree is only as strong as its foundation. If we take care of it, it'll grow taller than any secret we ever kept. A family is like an orchard. You can't just plant the trees and expect fruit. You have to endure the winters, prune the rot, and wait for the sun to do the work. You can't. The golden honey-thick light of the autumn sunset began to spill over the cliffs, reflecting off the Brass Haven plaque and the gray Pacific below. Done. The letters, the lies, the labor. All of it. Done. I retreated to the study as the family began to head inside for dinner. The room was no longer a museum of trauma. It was a sanctuary of peace. I picked up a final empty binder and placed the salt-stained 421st letter inside. I realized then the final identity reveal. The letter wasn't just dated for her scattering, but specifically for the day I would first hold my granddaughter on this island. Marielle's foresight wasn't just about survival. It was a map to the joy she knew would follow the storm. I added a photograph of the family working together in the orchard and closed the ledger. I didn't feel the snap of anger I'd lived with for years, only the gentle, satisfied click of a bridge inspector who has finally seen the structure hold under its ultimate load. The inspection is over, Marielle, I whispered. The bridge is standing. Good night, my love. I walked onto the porch and looked at the horizon where the sea met the sky in a line as straight and true as a well-built span. And I realized I wasn't waiting for a ferry anymore. I was already where I was meant to be. I sat in the wicker chair and watched the stars come out one by one over the haven. The island didn't just take Marielle back, it had taken us all smoothing over the jagged edges of our history until we were as worn and resilient as the cliffs themselves. I descended from the porch, my steps slow and deliberate, joining the family at the long, outdoor table on the sanctuary terrace. The smell of roasted vegetables and sea salt hung heavy in the evening air, a perfume of hard-won peace. There was no butler tonight, no cold matriarch and no desperate heirs, only a group of people who had survived a war of their own making. We ate in a shared silence that felt comfortable, almost wholly broken, only by Maya's bright questions about the constellations. I watched Cade Callum, pass a plate of warm bread to Maddox. "Pass the bread," Cade Maddox said, his voice stripped of its old bite. "You earned the wheat this year." It was a simple gesture, but to me it felt like the final rivet being driven into a bridge we had spent 35 years building. "I think Mother would have finally liked the noise at this table." Sloane whispered, her eyes catching the reflection of the house lights. I realized then that my own journey had come to a structural resolution. I have secretly updated my own will to ensure that this island remains a sanctuary for all of them, but I've passed the legal stewardship to Cade. He is the new inspector. Now the one who will guard the foundation I spent my life fearing was gone. A sunset is just the earth closing a ledger for the day, and tonight the ink was finally dry. As the family moved inside to put Maya to bed, her melodic laughter echoing against the stone, before fading into the house, I took a final walk to the very edge of the property. The rhythmic sound of the Pacific tide was a heartbeat beneath my feet. I stood where the fieldstone met the void, watching the lighthouse beam cut through the absolute dark of the sound. 19,000 words, 421 letters, one man, one bridge, final. I felt a sense of completion that no structural inspection could ever provide. "The load is balanced, Marielle," I murmured into the salt spray. "We're standing." The Whitmore name had been repaired by the truth, or perhaps it had simply been replaced by something stronger. How many years had I spent looking for a defect? I realized I was finally standing on a span that wouldn't buckle. I looked toward the point where the lighthouse stood as a sentinel against the deep. I discovered in the local records that the tower had been named Marielle's Light decades ago, long before her illness began. It was never just a maritime marker. It was her signal to bring me home, a light she had kept burning through every year of our shared silence. I turned back toward the glow in the sanctuary windows, the warmth of the house lights a beacon against the night. The smooth silver key in my pocket felt finally weightless, a tool for a door that no longer needed to be locked. As the beam of Marielle's light swept over me, heading out to sea to search for the next soul that needed a way home, I walked toward my family. I wasn't waiting for a ferry anymore. I was already where I was meant to be. Looking back on everything that happened, I now understand that the greatest mistake I made was not the family betrayal I endured, it was the silence I carried for so many years. I spent decades believing I was invisible, believing my life had no value inside that house. If there is one lesson I hope you take from this family story, it is this: never allow silence to replace truth. When pain is buried instead of spoken, resentment grows in the dark, and that quiet poison can slowly destroy an entire family story before anyone realizes what is happening. For a long time, I believed my life had become nothing more than a painful chapter of family betrayal. I thought anger and retaliation were the only answers left to me. But time revealed something deeper. What started as a wound caused by family betrayal slowly transformed into accountability, healing, and the rebuilding of a broken family story. Justice may sometimes be necessary, but revenge alone can never repair what a family has lost. True strength lies in deciding what kind of ending your story will have. If I could speak to the younger version of myself, I would tell him, do not wait decades to ask difficult questions, and never assume the worst about the people you love. Pain can blind us just as easily as greed can. In the darkest years of my life, when I felt abandoned and humiliated, I now believe that God was quietly guiding the path that would eventually reveal the truth and lead me out of that long shadow. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. I would truly like to hear your thoughts. If you ever found yourself in a situation like Callum facing betrayal, difficult choices, and a fractured family, what would you have done? Your perspective matters, so feel free to share it in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next story we share together. A gentle note: while this narrative reflects real human themes and emotions, certain details have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't for you, that's completely okay. There may be other stories here that resonate more with you.